Hey everyone, welcome to Dive Deeper.
Hey guys, for those who don't remember me, I'm Chris.
So next week is March break, and before we get to our warm-up question, let's go over some announcements of what's going on.
First of all, Dive Deeper is still on for next week, same time as usual. The main chapter will be Matthew 18, but since you have a lot of extra time not being in school, maybe you can also try reading one of the supplementary chapters and try to see how it connects with Matthew 18.
Second announcement, on Monday at 3:30 p.m., we're going to meet here at the church's building for a photo scavenger hunt around town. So Shauna is prepping some really fun stuff for this, so it should be a good time. We'll meet at the Commercial Street door where we come in for rally night because there's driver training happening in the gym. Then we'll send you out around town in groups, so make sure to wear good outdoor clothing, and your parents can pick you up here at the church at 5 p.m.
All right, so that's a couple things we've got planned for March break. For our warm-up question, tell your group about other plans you have for the break. Or hey, maybe you guys want to make plans as a group and do something fun together.
All right, Chris. Well, what verses stood out to you this week?
Well, I thought the beginning of the chapter was pretty interesting. So could you read verses 1 to 7 for me?
Sure. Now, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise, do not be afraid."
Thanks, Oliver. There are a couple things I want to pull out from this section. The first is about the glory of God. The disciples tell us that Jesus was transfigured. That is to say, his form changed. What did it change to? His face shone like the sun, his clothes became as white as light, and a bright cloud overshadowed them with a voice. Did you know that brightness or overwhelming light is physical representation of the glory of God? That is to say, the presence of God?
Yeah, this happened several times in history when God revealed himself. For instance, when God showed his glory to Moses and allows Moses to see him after he passes by him in Exodus 34. And when Moses meets God, his face too would shine so brightly that the Israelites asked him to wear a veil when speaking to them. Or in the New Testament, when Jesus reveals himself to Saul, who's later called Paul, on the Damascus Road, it says a light shone around him and blinded him, and that's in Acts 9. Remember this also happened in broad daylight, I guess, too, for Paul.
Yeah, so the glory of God seems to be an overwhelming thing to experience. Can you imagine it? What seems to be the response?
Well, people are afraid. The disciples are overwhelmed at the sight of Jesus transfigured and the voice of the Father proclaiming, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased, hear him." But something happens after that, too.
Yeah, as often happens in these stories, Jesus tells his disciples not to be afraid. So that brings us to our questions. Why do you think the response of those who come into the presence of God is fear? And why does Jesus say not to be afraid? Lastly, if you have time, have you ever witnessed something that made you feel like worshiping God? All right, Oliver, what chunk stood out to you this week?
Well, it was the last story in this chapter, the one where some people ask Peter if Jesus pays the taxes to support the Jewish temple. And Jesus kind of answers that he doesn't really have to because he's God's son. But he does anyway so that he doesn't offend the Jewish people. That's the verse that really stood out to me. So could you read that for everybody, Chris?
Sure. Matthew 17:27. But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours.
All right, so what I observed about this verse was that it's kind of funny that Jesus said that he wanted to avoid offending people, because he offended people all the time.
Yeah, like when he ate with the sinners that offended the religious people.
Yeah, or when he said offensive things like the only way to have a relationship with God is through him. Like, that's offensive.
Okay, so why do you think here he says he doesn't want to offend people?
Well, I think the point here is that we shouldn't try to offend people. We should avoid offending people if we can. Like, for instance, there's one way to tell people that they are a sinner that's just aggressive and offensive, like yelling through a megaphone, "You're all sinners!" You know, that is true, but there's probably a way to tell people that that's less offensive. And then there are some things about the teachings of Jesus that just offend people, and there's no way to get around it. Some things offend religious people, like sometimes when we break their traditions, but also things offend non-Christians, like when we say Jesus is the only way to God, or how God's commandments for how we should live are sometimes offensive to people.
Okay, so there are times when we can't help it. There are essential things in teachings of Jesus that are just offensive sometimes. But if we don't have to, we should try not to offend people.
Yeah, I think that's what this story is showing. So let's talk about that in our groups. What are ways Christians are sometimes offensive that we should avoid? And then what are essential things about Christianity that are just offensive? All right, well, we hope that you had a great discussion with your group.
Yeah, so now take a moment to share some things from your own readings yourself.
And we hope to see you next Monday at the photo scavenger hunt and next Wednesday for Dive Deeper. See you then.